Far out in the sea, where the water is very deep, the Sea King ruled the undersea world. In the deepest spot of the sea was his castle. The walls were made of blue coral. On the roof were shells that opened and closed when the water passed by. And that is where the Sea King lived with his mother and 4 daughters, each one born year apart. The youngest of the 4 princesses was the little mermaid. She spent so much of her time swimming to ships that had fallen to the bottom of the sea. The ships held treasures from the world above. She would fill her arms and set up her collection, here and there. All the while, she would sing. As she did, fish circled around to hear her. For the little mermaid's voice was the most beautiful one under the sea. The girls knew that when they turned 15, they could swim up to the surface for the first time. It would be a long time that the little mermaid had to wait, as she was the youngest. So she made her grandmother tell her all about life up on land. Tales about ships and towns and every bit of stories about humans that she knew. Soon, the eldest sister turned 15. She was the first to be allowed to rise up to the surface. When she came back, she had many wonders to tell her sisters about. She told about resting on soft white sand. High above was a deep blue sky with the puffy white clouds. Later, the sun set, she said, and the whole sky turned gold and red. She had watched the birds fly high above her, dipping and making turns in the red and gold sky. When the next sister turned 15, it was winter. She told of icebergs floating in the sea and shining bright. All the ships stayed far away from icebergs, she said, as in fear. But the icebergs did not seem lonely. They were like friends, floating close to each other. When it was the third sister's turn, she told about moving as close as she could to the gate of a town. She heard people call out horses that went clip-clopping down the street, and even music that she had never heard before. All this the little mermaid heard with wonder. It wasn't fair that she had to wait the longest. At last, the day came when she turned 15 too. Now, she could rise up over the surface and see for herself. When she came up over the water, the little mermaid was next to a large ship. On the ship, beautiful music was playing. Sailors were dancing on the deck. They were laughing and having a fine time. It must be a party. Now and then, as the waves lifted up the little mermaid, she could see better. A handsome young man stepped out of the deck. When he did, 100 rockets rose in the air. The party was for him. Was it his birthday? She swam closer. She swam to the shore. pulling him behind her. It was not easy to pull the young man up onto the dry sand, but she did it. Was he dead? He sang a sad song. All of a sudden, the prince started to move. "Oh, are you all right?" she asked, and touched his forehead. The next day was the royal party. The prince had not been not looking forward to going to it. Hours of standing with finely dressed people who talk and talk and have nothing to say. He asked the little mermaid if she might come with him. She nodded with a big yes. That day, the little mermaid by his side, the prince felt glad. Sometimes he would make a comment in a low voice to her, and by her eyes and face, he knew that she understood. After that, the prince wanted the little mermaid by his side every day. He thought he could even fall in love with her, but she still held out hope to marry the one with the lovely voice he remembered from when he had been rescued. Of course, it could not be his wonderful new friend who was not able to talk, let alone sing. They told the father the trouble their youngest sister was in. The father swam up to the wedding ship. He saw the prince and princesses getting ready to marry. He knew that his daughter did not use the knife the night before. At once, the Sea King rushed to see the Sea Witch. She laughed. She said there was only one way to save his youngest daughter from her fate. If he would just hand over his scepter to her, the little mermaid could be saved. With the scepter in her hand, the Sea Witch would rule the underworld kingdom. The Sea King took a deep breath. What else could he do? So he agreed. The Sea Witch grabbed the scepter and laughed in glee. She rushed to the wedding ship to see her victory. The little mermaid saw the Sea Witch rise out of the sea. She saw that with the scepter, the Sea Witch had become a huge sea monster. Tentacles were twisting out from all over her body like an octopus. The little mermaid knew she must protect the prince and even her new bride, so she took out a knife. Just then, one of the Sea Witch's tentacles reached out and lifted the little mermaid right off the ship. "This is the end for you!" growled the Sea Witch. The Sea Witch reeled back in pain, and the little mermaid was freed on the ship. The guests ran around in fear. The prince shot an arrow after arrow at the monster. Finally, the Sea Witch dropped down under the water. As she fell, the little mermaid's voice was let go, and it returned to her. The princess then shouted in a gruff, harsh voice, "What a lousy kingdom this is! You can't even have a proper wedding." The prince heard the princess, and he knew that she was not who he thought she was. Then the little mermaid started to sing. The prince knew that the voice he remembered belonged to the very one he had grown to love. The angry princess stormed off the wedding ship, and her family followed close behind. When the Sea King arrived, the scepter was floating in the sea as if it were waiting for him. With a sweep of his arm, it was his again. "Well," said the Sea King, "I see my daughter is in good hands." And with a wave of his scepter, he lifted the little mermaid back onto the ship. But the prince put his arms around her. "Now I know it was you along," said the prince. "Will you marry me?" The little mermaid had her voice back now, but with all the happiness in her heart, she could not manage to speak. So she nodded yes, with a warm smile, and a wedding on board ship took place after all. The end.